He's clearly among the best brains in the financial world. It's such a pleasure to have with us Mr. Uday Kotak. Mr. Kotak, thanks so much for talking to us.
Delighted to be here.
Mr. Kotak, what's the sense you're picking up here at the India Economic Summit? Is the buzz around India really back? Are foreign investors ready to put money into India?
I think foreign investors and companies are getting more interested in India, but thank God there is no exuberance. So you want a more steadily rising interest in India from the global community as India works towards Achhe Din Dheere Dheere.
Achhe Din Dheere Dheere, but there's plenty of exuberance in the Indian equity markets. It seems Achhe Din already here as far as the stock markets go. What's really happening there? Is it reflecting what's happening on the ground? Is it a sense of the real economy, or are markets moving a little way too ahead, the equity markets?
Markets are ahead of the real economy. My sense is the real economy right now is at around 5.5% GDP for the current year.
Right.
But I see a steadily improving real economy. So if I had to take a 5-year average, I see it as 6.5% plus. On the other hand, I think the markets are beginning to discount the future, which is what normally happens. And it's a self-fulfilling circle. If markets start discounting the future and provide capital at more attractive valuations to Indian companies, it helps manage and deleverage balance sheets. So I see this as a virtuous loop.
Okay. At the same time, is there a concern that perhaps the Indian equity markets are overheated right now?
I don't think they are overheated. I think the markets are priced at a premium, but they are not exuberant. So there will be some ups and downs, but directionally, I think we are in good shape.
And it's a lot to do with both domestic and global factors. Domestically, of course, we've made the right moves. This government has pressed the right buttons in many ways, given that assurance to investors that they are moving forward on the path of reforms, on the path of growth revival. Is that confidence really showing up also in the Indian equity markets?
I think Indian equity markets are also benefiting by domestic savings. And here I want to make a very significant shift which is happening in front of us. 2 years ago, Indian savers were obsessed with gold and real estate.
Okay.
And India was a huge exporter of savings. When India imports $60 billion of gold, Indian savers are sending money out.
Right.
This year, I think gold imports should be in the range of around $15 to $20 billion.
Right.
So something like $40 billion of savings which used to go in gold 2 years ago have stopped moving into gold. At the same time, real estate has been pretty stagnating.
Sure.
So finally, Indians are coming back to the joy of financial savings. We are seeing that reflect in bank deposits. We are seeing that in flows to equity mutual funds. We are seeing a pickup in life insurance premium.
Right.
I think movement to financial savings is a very big plus.
And is that a trend which is here to stay? Are we supporting? Is the policy environment going to support that trend?
I think two things have happened. First, I must compliment the RBI governor for making sure that financial savings are attractive.
Right.
So money moved away from other forms of savings into financial savings.
Right.
Now, with some policy move and macroeconomic factors, particularly current account coming under control, and fiscal deficit remaining where it is, we should see a continuation of financial savings.
Right. You mentioned very importantly insurance, and I'd like to take forward the expectation that in the winter session of Parliament there will be movement forward on the insurance bill. Are you optimistic that it will finally go through?
I am pretty hopeful, and let's see whether it happens. But if it does, I think it's a promise the government made after it came to power, and it is fulfilling it.
Among the reform measures that the government has taken recently in the last 1 month, we've seen a number of announcements. Which, according to you, has had the most significant impact, or something that's likely to have an impact and has been the real game changer?
I think diesel deregulation, if it is true to spirit, that's a big plus. But
would you credit the government for it, because it's after all falling crude oil prices?
I think the test will be when crude prices go up.
Right.
But I would like to believe the government has made up its mind and it's going to let energy prices find their own level in the future. So I think that's a very significant change which India has seen. I would also like to believe that we will see changes, hopefully in the land bill.
Right.
I think the government has been very proactive of wanting to make changes in the new companies bill, which was introduced by the previous government with all its problems. So that can be another one. The GST bill is something which we are hopeful about, which they would make the change. And at some level, I think the change of discourse in civil society, where things which are beyond economics, but crucial, like India being clean.
Right, right.
I mean, it's obvious. I mean, these are the kind of things which we need to reinforce because we want to move towards a better society.
So do campaigns like Swachh Bharat and Cleaning India really have an overall economic impact as well? How does it impact investor sentiment, for instance?
In my view, these are connections which are more long-term, that India stands for things which the world has taken for granted in their countries.
Right.
And India actually was behind the curve.
Right.
Being clean, having hygiene has a lot of positives, including on healthcare and everything else.
Sure.
I think things like you wash your hands before you eat.
Right.
I mean, simple things, but nobody was communicating that. So if we get some of these things right, the benefits are sustainable over a long period of time.
You're talking about an average of 6.5% growth over the next 5 years. That's clearly a number that may not satisfy many people, including the present government that would be aiming at much higher growth rates. Or do you think we still have to wait and see, because it will be a long time before India can start talking about double-digit growth rates, for instance?
I've said average, and
Right.
I've said 6.5% plus.
Plus, okay.
Okay, but subject to these two factors, keep in mind that the world is very slow. The global GDP, which used to be 5%, people are now talking about 3%. Therefore,
Right.
India will also import deflation.
Right,
There is surplus capacity in the world,
right.
which will be imported into India. So things like that will take away some of the GDP growth we would have got if the world was really booming.
Right.
And therefore, in that context, in the context of a much slower world, if we average 6.5% plus over 5 years,
Then
it's a pretty good achievement.
I have to talk to you about the impact of falling crude oil prices. You, of course, mentioned diesel deregulation, but the overall impact this trend is going to have on an economy like India that really imports a large part of its crude requirements. Now, this has also come at a good time for this government, of course, but with this trend continuing, how much will the Indian economy benefit?
India at $105 oil used to import $150 billion a year.
Right.
So 20% drop
Right.
is taking away $30 billion.
Right.
25 to 30% drop takes $40 billion, and that much money with deregulation,
Right.
most of it comes in the hands of Indian people.
Right. And it's, of course, a bonus for the government also, because one, they've been able to push forward this very critical reform, and then, of course, the deficits look much prettier.
So this will actually, in some ways, improve consumption, and I see a positive cycle in place within the next 6 to 9 months.
You're saying that so finally, with petrol diesel prices coming down,
Yes.
We're going to see that impact on consumption. Explain to us how that story will really play
Because
out.
the consumer will have more surplus. You're
Right.
paying less for your car, petrol,
Right.
for your diesel.
Right.
Also, say, various aspects of the economy like
So consumer demand will go up.
That's correct, and that will be that much more surplus. Therefore, this is like, in many ways, a fiscal boost or a stimulus which is coming through lower prices of oil, which should certainly help. And along with that, if your fiscal deficit is under control,
Right.
you are in good shape.
And of course, inflation numbers are looking much better now.
That's correct.
And that's, again, an impact that we're going to see will continue to happen if we see diesel prices, because that has a ripple effect at the end of the day.
That's correct. Absolutely.
I have to talk to you about interest rates, because, again, inflation and interest rates are linked, and there's always a trade-off between growth and inflation in many ways. Many in the industry believe that Governor Rajan should go ahead and cut rates now. The timing is right, given that inflation is trending downwards. Do you share that view?
I'm of the view that between now and March, we could see at least 25 basis, if not 50 basis points reduction in the rates because of inflation coming under control. But I also keep in mind the fact that Governor Rajan has a responsibility to keep on making financial savings attractive.
Right.
And inevitably, the borrower's voice is louder than the saver's.
Right.
But savers should remain in the financial sector. If they start moving out of the financial sector, that's not a good thing. Therefore,
Right.
that is a very important balance.
Which we often don't talk about,
That's
in
correct.
fact, when
the
we talk.
saver's interest
Right.
is as important as listening to the borrower's noise.
Okay.
And getting that balance right is important.
So while you say that you expect a rate cut between now and March, do you think that so far his position on not cutting rates, and perhaps even if we don't see a rate cut on the 2nd of December, would be a correct decision?
My view is a February rate cut as my base case. I would put a 70% probability to a February cut and only a 30% probability to December.
Okay, so you're saying 70% it's only happening in February, and you agree with that view. That's my point.
My view is that you have to balance the interests of borrowers and savers.
How do you respond to many in the industry, and you've talked about that noise, who believe that high interest rates are clearly hurting growth?
No, question is, when you look at high interest rates, look at them in the context of inflation.
Right.
Therefore, you want real interest rates to be positive.
Right.
Having said that, I think as inflation comes down, there is some more room the RBI governor has today than he had 6 months ago.
Right. Are there any concerns really going forward? Because there are plenty of positives we're talking about. Of course, right noises being made, right decisions being taken, the global environment supporting India in many ways in terms of crude prices falling. But any concerns going forward, both on the domestic front and on the global front?
I think on the global front, the thing which is got to be looked at very closely is geopolitics. And while India benefits from lower oil, keep in mind many countries get into trouble.
Right.
So, and that could lead to geopolitical situations. I mean, think about countries like Russia, Venezuela, Ukraine, Middle East.
Right.
So you could see unintended outcomes out of a more unstable world. Therefore, geopolitics, in my view, is a significant factor which is outside India's control.
Right.
And keep an eye on that. With reference to India, I think right now we are heading into a virtuous cycle, and what we have to be careful about is that there are no risks of accidents. I hope that Pakistan behaves itself and it doesn't lead to an increased conflict. So things like that we have to keep an eye on.
Your views really on some of the foreign policy moves made by this government, because you mentioned Pakistan particularly. Your thoughts on what's really gone on in the last 6 months on the foreign policy front and how the government has done?
I think government has done extremely well. Love thy neighbor, that was the first starting policy.
Right.
Then expanded to Japan, then went to the US. I think it's quite phenomenal. And actually, I want to change to one other subject which is close to my heart, and that is education.
I was about to come to that because you spoke on that panel, and it's very significant that you mentioned a statement that's clearly resonated amongst many in the audience, and it's really become the talking point here at the India Economic Summit today. The fact that you said that you're ashamed that your children studied overseas. It's a very important point.
I think when we evaluated as parents, what is the best opportunity for education for undergraduation, post-schooling for our children, we came to the conclusion that it was overseas. But as an Indian, I feel bad about it.
You said you almost feel ashamed about it.
That's ashamed about it because as an Indian, I cannot provide the quality of education which I as a parent would have wanted for my children in India.
Right.
And therefore, as an Indian, I want to make a difference.
Right.
About how we change this dynamic, both in terms of civil society change, mindset change, to making it attractive for parents to look at the Indian option.
Right.
And it was a classic case of two different roles. One is I need to do what is right as a parent.
Right.
But as an Indian, it bothered me a lot.
So what needs to be done to make sure that we are moving on the path where parents like you don't feel ashamed and can feel that there's enough in India that they can at least make sure that their children continue to study in India, higher education in India, the standards really improve? What's the kind of education reform that's needed?
The starting point of change is civil society. Indians need to respect teachers. In the last 20 to 30 years, ends have become more important than means. We were of a generation where we looked up to teachers as gurus.
Right.
Teachers are no longer getting the kind of respect they deserve from society.
But isn't that in many ways also aping the West, because that's the trend in the West as well?
Having said that, I think America really takes care of its teachers, especially at college level. It may be a different issue at school levels.
Right. So you're talking about wages, you're talking about salaries being provided.
Salaries, treatment,
Right.
Think about the younger generation which is going through the current educational process.
Right.
How many of those younger people want to take up teaching as a profession?
Right.
And we need to change the dynamics of teaching. There is much more digital. We have to make it attractive for people to think about teaching as a profession.
Right. Do you think the present government is seized of this problem?
The sense I got from
the education
Minister Irani
right.
on the panel was it resonated, and
right.
this government is making a big difference. The Prime Minister's spending the Teachers' Day with kids. So we need to change mindsets of Indians.
Right. You talked about Clean India, you've talked about some of the other moves. Do you think in many ways Prime Minister Modi has come with a lot of right goals, right agenda points with him, which may not necessarily have immediate economic benefit, but have a much larger long-term benefit for India?
I would like to believe that a lot of changes which we needed was in the area of discourse.
Right.
So, schooling, teachers,
Toilets.
education, toilets, cleanliness.
Right.
Being with the soldiers on Diwali. So, you are seeing a very different mindset creation, and I think that's a big plus. And therefore, the economic revival, I believe, is more gradual and more sustained over time, but don't expect miracle economic actions in a hurry.
And you believe in any case the moves that are being made are way more important. And how do you respond to those critics who say there's too much talk and less action on the ground?
I think you have to look at action in different ways. I am a believer that long-term transformation of civil society is the most important action which needs to be taken, because that's what matters to us as Indians.
Right.
And some of that is happening. Economic policies, the art of the possible.
Right, as Minister Jaitley said.
That's correct.
Right. The art of the possible, and that's something that the government will be really experimenting with in the weeks and months to come. We're all eyes clearly also on the next budget. When we talk of reforms, what according to you should be the immediate priority for this government to take forward that will ensure that India moves on the high growth path?
I think on economic reforms, the amendment of the New Companies Bill or implementation of rules, GST, land reform bill, keeping the fiscal deficit under control, solving the capital issues of state-owned banks are some of the priorities I would put.
All right, it is a long wish list, but we know that the government has got its eyes on all of these problems and is intending to solve it. Mr. Uday Kotak, thanks so much for your time, sir. Pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you to be with you on this channel. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.